Hello, it's Denise again from HQAA, and this is going to be our first part of our first tutorial. I'm going to break it up into two sections with one photo that we're going to be looking at for basic editing techniques. So the first part of this is going to be how to process your raw photos or NEF photos if you're using Nikon, which I am. But I still call them raw because it's just a habit. So when I get home from a shoot, I go ahead and upload my photos into Aperture, which is my raw software editing program. You can use any system that you like for it. This is just how I go about pictures. So I wanted to start off with when you get home from a shoot, and you have all these options of photos that you take. And I tend to overtake photos. When I'm at a shoot, I'll come back and typically only edit about 10% of the pictures that I take. 1 in 10 is a pretty accurate number for me. So I want to show you kind of my process in selecting the pictures that I edit, as well as post online to share in my galleries, and then show you how I go about editing them. So this shoot is from the San Francisco Zoo in San Francisco, California. And this was shot several months back, but I wanted to let you know a little bit about this series. When I first got to the zoo in the morning, I tend to go right in the morning first thing. It's best time of day then or at closing because the lighting is typically nice, though in San Francisco we're pretty lucky and have those overcast clouds for us. So anyway, I love zebras. I was looking at their Africa exhibit and starting to look at the zebras. And I really wanted to get a good shot of these guys. However, if you notice that my friend here is laying in quite a bit of mud. And so no matter what I do, this still isn't going to be a perfectly pretty picture. So while I was shooting, I realized that there was a cattle eager right in front of me, and that maybe I should take that opportunity to go ahead and photograph something that I might get a little bit better shot of. So I switched to focusing on the cattle egret. However, the background is still a bit distracting in this picture. It's not real focused. So I wanted to move myself a little bit to get a little bit better shot. This is still a nice picture. I might even consider editing it. I like the feathers that are off the back and whatnot. But the background is still a little bit busy. It's a little bit distracting, saying, hey, is that a zebra? So I took another photo and made sure that I just had the trees in the background, making a really nice blurred out bokeh in the back there. However, the first shot that I took, which is fairly typical of me, it was not centered properly or composed properly. So I took one last shot and actually got pretty close for me. I usually do a fair amount of cropping and post-processing, shame on me, but this one turned out really well. So this is the photo that we're going to be using for this first tutorial, and again, it's of a cattle egret at the San Francisco Zoo, and we're going to go ahead and get started in Aperture, or your raw editing software. So the first thing that we want to do is look at the exposure. Now, if you look in whatever panel that you have here, it's in the upper left-hand corner on the histogram that you have, and that's going to tell you how properly exposed, especially if you're working on a laptop. Those pesky laptop screens are notorious for being either too bright or too dark, so please check out your histograms to make sure you're properly exposed. You want the majority of your colors and tones, shadows, highlights to be somewhere in the boundaries of this. If you notice on the right side of my histogram, there's a tail going upwards into the highlights, which means I have some blown out areas. And those blown out areas are right along the top of this bird's back, being that the bird is white. It's pretty easy to mess up and get some highlights. However, if you shoot in RAW versus JPEG, which I highly recommend, you can still fix it. So what I'm going to do is go down to my exposure panel. And your exposure panel in your raw editing software is going to let you change a bit of this. So I'm going to go ahead and use my tool called Recovery. And I'm going to slide it. And I want you to look at the histogram while I do that. It's going to bring that histogram down. Now look at the picture. And it's also going to bring those tones down quite a bit. So you can go ahead and find out what works best for you in that tonal range and see what works for your photo. My shadows are actually pretty far away from the true shadow, which means I don't have any true blacks in this picture. It's a little bit hazy looking, which it was that day. So I'm going to use a different tool for that. Instead of moving my exposure bar, because I know if I move this exposure bar to make it darker, it's going to darken the bird. If If I make it lighter, we're going to get too light of a bird. So instead of using that tool, I'm going to go down to my Enhance panel, and this is where you're going to find the contrast, saturation, and vibrancy tools. So if I bump up my contrast just a little bit, I want to be paying attention to my photo, but you'll notice in the histogram, the blacks are moving closer to the edge, and the whites are also. So I do want to be careful about that tail going back up. I'm going to find the level of black that I prefer, and then I'm going to make sure that my recovery is adjusted appropriately so that that tail doesn't go too far back up. I'm also going to look at this photo in terms of the vibrancy. Nikons tend to come out of the box on a neutral setting, which means they don't do a whole lot of work for you in the vibrancy and contrast department. I personally like working that way. That way I can control how much contrast and vibrancy that there is, or saturation. Versus Canons tend to come preset with a little bit more oomph, a little bit more kick to them. So you are going to have more vibrant pictures. Now, either camera can be reset to mimic the other, to have any of those settings, but just as a heads up if you're using one or the other. I don't tend to like to use saturation as much to enhance because it tends to make the picture look faker. Faker, I don't think that's a word, but less real, and the colors are just a little too harsh by using that. I also don't want to go too far down, obviously, because that's going to desaturate the picture. So what I'm going to do instead of using the saturation tool is I'm going to take the vibrancy tool. The vibrancy tool is a lot more mellow, I think, in my eyes, and it's going to increase those colors without overdoing it. However, when I bump up this vibrancy, I really like the colors of the green and the yellow here, but the bird turned a little bit blue. Now, since it's a white bird, I have a pretty good reference of what color it's supposed to be. And I'm going to go to whichever panel allows me to selectively control the saturation of different colors. So in Aperture, again, it's in this panel over here. I'm going to make sure that layer is turned on and that I have a blue selected. If you want to be even more precise about what color you're using, there's an eyedrop tool. You can eyedrop the shade of blue that you want to affect, and then I'm going to take my saturation tool and desaturate it. Again, if you go all the way, it's not going to look right because there should be some color there. I was standing in near a rock on an overcast day, so there should be some blue hues, hints, even if you're not consciously aware that they're there. They create a shape to it, so you want to make sure that the saturation tool isn't completely desaturated. If you go all the way up, you can see how blue those tones can really get. So again, I'm going to pull it down a little bit so that it's not so blue, but not so far that I completely desaturate and take away all the tones. The last thing I'm going to look at in this, I have some other options here regarding levels, vignettes, edge sharpening. I prefer to do that all in Photoshop, which is going to be the second half of this tutorial. But the other thing I'm going to go ahead and do in Aperture is a crop. So, and this is also the time that you would straighten your photos as well if they were crooked. So the crop tool for me is just by pressing the letter C, but it may be a different keystroke for you. And I'm going to look over here on my crop box here. Now, a lot of people don't crop their photos, or they crop it to an arbitrary size. There's nothing wrong with not cropping it to a standard size, other than the fact that when you get them cropped as wall portraits, they're not going to be the way they looked on your computer. You're either going to have to trim them off on a side, or it could even be ruined if it's a totally oblong picture and you need it to fit inside of an 8x10. That's just not going to work. So I love to work primarily in a 2x3, which is also the same as a 4x6 ratio. I also tend to like 5x7s a lot. However, squares can be beneficial. It just depends what your personal preference is. And please pay attention to the composition of your photos too. Some photos look better in squares. Some photos look better in 8x10s, where they can be a little bit more, not quite a square, but squarer. 2x3 is a longer crop. So for this picture, I think it's going to work really well. I'm going to drag my crop box so that I can make sure that it's cropped the way I want. This photo really doesn't need a whole lot. Technically, if I wanted to, I could really leave it without the crop. So that's just a personal preference on what type of picture you want to do. So go ahead, play around with your crop, make sure it suits your picture, make sure your subject isn't looking out of the frame, on the very edge of the frame. Make sure you're balanced. You can check out the slideshow tutorial that I had. It wasn't really part of this series, but it went over basic composition techniques and can help you out there. So I'm going to go ahead and end this tutorial here. I'm going to bring it over into Photoshop in the next series and show you how to finish up editing your photo.